I was standing at my bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of my old flannel shirt, when my phone buzzed on the edge of the sink. I was getting ready to drive over to my son Daniel's house for what he'd called a family dinner. His wife Nicole's idea, he said. A chance for everyone to reconnect. I had a card in my jacket pocket with a check for $2,000 inside. It was money I'd set aside by skipping my annual physical and eating lunch at home every day for 4 months. I wanted Daniel to know I was still there for him, even if things between us had grown strained. I picked up the phone expecting a text from my grandson Marcus asking if I could bring dessert. Instead, the screen showed a message from Jim Hargrove. Jim had been my attorney for 31 years and my closest friend since our sons played Little League on the same team. The preview text made me grab the edge of the counter. "Don't go to that house tonight. Call me. It's urgent. Please, Robert." I dialed him with hands that weren't quite steady. He answered on the first ring, and the voice I heard was not the measured, unhurried voice of the man who had helped me through my divorce, my retirement, and the death of my wife Margaret 3 years ago. He sounded like a man who had been running. "Robert, are you still home?" "I'm home," I said. "Jim, what is this? I need you to listen to me, and I need you to stay calm." He exhaled. "I have a contact in the county probate clerk's office. She called me an hour ago. Daniel and Nicole filed a petition this afternoon for emergency guardianship. They're alleging cognitive decline. They have a supporting affidavit from a physician, a doctor, Philip Strand. Robert, they're claiming you have early-stage dementia." I sat down on the edge of the bathtub. Dementia. My son had filed papers saying his father had dementia. "There's more," Jim said. "The petition lists your assets as being at risk of mismanagement. They're requesting immediate control of your bank accounts and the authority to make medical decisions on your behalf. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9, but the petition mentions a medical evaluation happening tonight. Is there a doctor coming to Daniel's dinner?" I thought about the phone call 2 weeks ago when Daniel had mentioned, very casually, that an old colleague of Nicole's would be stopping by a doctor, just for drinks, nothing formal. I'd thought nothing of it. "It's an ambush," I said. "Yes," Jim said. "Robert, don't go. Come to my office in the morning. We'll fight this the right way." I was quiet for a long moment. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, 68 years old, gray hair that needed a cut, a shirt that had seen better days. From the outside, I looked exactly like what they thought I was, a retired widower, living on a fixed income, driving a 10-year-old Buick, clipping coupons from the Sunday paper. I had cultivated that image carefully for years, ever since Margaret got sick and I realized that the people around us changed when they thought we had money. "I'm going," I said. "Robert, I need to understand why. I need to look my son in the eye and hear him say it. And Jim, I need evidence. Not secondhand. Evidence." There was a long pause. "If they get a signature out of you tonight, or if that doctor writes anything down, he won't get what he's expecting," I said. "I'll call you when I leave." I went to the hall closet and opened the wooden box on the top shelf that I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a small digital recorder I'd used during hospital rounds, back when I was still operating. I checked the battery. Full. I clipped it inside my breast pocket, beneath the flap, where the microphone faced outward. Then I looked at myself once more in the mirror and made a deliberate choice. I let my shoulders fall. I softened my eyes. I shuffled slightly as I walked to my car, practicing the gait of a man who was just a little uncertain on his feet, just a little slower than he used to be. If they wanted to see a confused old man, I would give them a performance they would remember. The drive to Daniel's house in Naperville took 40 minutes. I knew the roads well. I'd driven them hundreds of times. The neighborhood had changed since they moved in 8 years ago. The houses were bigger now, the landscaping more elaborate, the driveways lined with new vehicles. Daniel's house was a 4,000-square-foot colonial with a 3-car garage and a kitchen that Nicole had remodeled twice in 5 years. They lived expensively. I had always wondered how, given that Daniel's marketing consultancy had been struggling, but I told myself it wasn't my business. I parked on the street and sat for a moment. I tapped the recorder to make sure the light was blinking. Then I climbed out slowly, left my shoulders curved, let my feet drag just slightly on the pavement. Daniel opened the door before I reached the porch. Dad, there you are. His voice was too loud, the way people speak to someone they've already decided is hard of hearing. He clapped me on the shoulder. We were starting to wonder. Did you get turned around? The highway was backed up, I said, letting my voice waver just a little at the edges. I think I may have taken the wrong exit, but I found it. Daniel exchanged a quick look over his shoulder toward the hallway. I caught it. Come on in, he said. There's someone I want you to meet. The living room was warm and bright. Nicole was standing near the fireplace, holding a glass of red wine, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. She smiled at me with her mouth, but not her eyes. Robert, she said, with that tone she'd perfected over the years, gentle, slightly condescending, like she was addressing a sweet but unreliable child. So glad you made it. A man stood up from the armchair near the window. He was perhaps 50, trim, wearing a blazer over an open-collar shirt. He had the kind of even, professional smile that doesn't reach the eyes. Dad, this is Dr. Strand, Daniel said. He and Nicole went to school together. He's in town for a conference. Dr. Strand extended his hand. Mr. Callahan, Daniel's told me a great deal about you. I shook it loosely, letting my grip be weaker than it was, letting my eyes settle somewhere past his left ear rather than meeting his gaze directly. Wonderful, I said vaguely. Are you staying for dinner? I am, he said, and I saw him make a small note on the slim leather notebook he carried. They seated me at the far end of the dining table, away from the main conversation. Daniel sat at the head. Nicole sat beside Dr. Strand. My grandson Marcus, who was 19 and home from his first year at Northwestern, sat across from me with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had been told to stay quiet and was finding it difficult. I noticed immediately that everyone else had proper wine glasses. In front of me was a thick plastic tumbler with a lid, the kind used for children or hospital patients. Nicole noticed me looking at it. We thought it would be easier, Robert, she said, her voice full of manufactured warmth. You know, with your hands. Last time you were here, you had a little trouble with the glassware. I had never dropped a glass at their table. Not once. My hands were perfectly steady, the hands that had performed 11,000 surgical procedures over a 35-year career. But I said nothing. I wrapped both hands around the plastic tumbler and let them tremble slightly before lifting it to my lips. Dr. Strand made another note. The dinner conversation flowed around me. Daniel talked about a business venture, throwing around words like leverage and liquidity and market position with the confidence of a man who had watched too many financial podcasts. Nicole mentioned, casually, a new investment property they were considering. Marcus barely spoke. I ate my soup and let my spoon clink against the bowl occasionally, let my gaze drift to the middle distance when anyone asked me a question. Answered just slowly enough and just slightly off topic enough to give Dr. Strand what he was looking for. Robert, Dr. Strand said pleasantly, cutting his steak with precise strokes. Daniel tells me you used to be in medicine. Surgery, wasn't it? Oh yes, I said, looking at my plate. A long time ago now. Do you miss it? Sometimes I forget that I did it at all, I said, letting the words come out soft and disconnected. He wrote something down. Then Marcus looked up from his plate. He had his mother's dark eyes. His mother was my daughter-in-law's sister, long out of the picture, and he had Margaret's stubbornness. He looked at me, then at his parents, and something shifted in his expression. Grandpa, he said carefully, did they tell you about the Lakeview property? The table went very still. Daniel set his fork down. Marcus, what Lakeview property? I asked, letting my voice sound distant and confused. It's nothing, Dad, Daniel said quickly. Just something we're looking into. An investment for the future. Don't worry about it. He should know, Marcus said, his voice rising. You told me he was going to be living there. You said after tonight. Marcus. Nicole's voice was a blade. Go to your room. I'm not 12, Mom. You're a guest in this house and you'll... He's my grandfather. Marcus stood up, knocking his napkin to the floor. He looked at me with something raw and desperate in his eyes. Grandpa, the Lakeview property is a memory care facility. They've already put a deposit down. They're planning to move you there after tonight. He looked at his father. I heard you on the phone last week. You said the doctor was going to confirm the diagnosis, and you'd have the paperwork signed before he even knew what was happening. The silence that followed was total. The kind of silence that exists in an operating room when something has gone irreversibly wrong. Daniel stood up. "Get out of this room." "Daniel," I said, my voice soft and uncertain, right on the edge of distress. "What is the boy talking about? Is someone going to explain to me what's happening?" But inside, every nerve in my body was recording. Every word, every expression, every second of it was going straight into the microphone in my pocket. Dr. Strand had stopped writing. He was watching the family implosion with the expression of a man recalibrating. I asked to use the restroom and excused myself slowly from the table. Once I rounded the corner into the hallway and was out of their sight line, I straightened completely. My shuffle disappeared. I moved silently down the hall toward Daniel's home office, a room I had been in many times over the years. The door was unlocked. I slipped inside and closed it behind me without a sound. Daniel was not a careful man about privacy. His laptop was open on the desk, screen still illuminated. I sat down and moved through his files quickly and efficiently, the way I had once moved through a chest cavity, knowing exactly what I was looking for and where it would be. I found the folder labeled Dad, Legal, within 2 minutes. Inside was a draft of the guardianship petition, with Dr. Strand listed as the evaluating physician. There was a draft power of attorney that gave Daniel full control of my personal accounts, my investment accounts, and any additional assets. There was a letter from a realtor estimating the value of my house at $420,000. And there was a document I did not expect, a loan agreement with a private lender called Meridian Capital, with Daniel's signature on the bottom and a note reading collateral. 1147 Ashwood Drive, my address. He had already used my house as collateral on a loan. I photographed everything with my phone. Then I opened his email and searched for Meridian Capital. What I found turned my stomach. Final notice. Payment overdue. 60 days delinquent. The original loan amount was $900,000. Daniel had borrowed against my house, a house I owned free and clear without my knowledge, using documents I had never signed. The handwriting on the transfer paperwork was not mine, but it looked close enough to fool a distracted lender. I heard footsteps in the hallway. I closed the laptop screen, moved away from the desk, and picked up a framed photograph from the bookshelf, a picture of Margaret and me on our anniversary trip to the Oregon coast. I turned toward the door with it in my hands, letting my face go soft and confused. Nicole opened the door. She stared at me. "Robert, what are you doing in here?" "I was looking for the bathroom," I said, holding up the photograph. "I saw this picture of Margaret and I got turned around somehow." She studied me for a moment, calculating. Then the tension in her face eased. She believed it. She saw a confused old man who had wandered into the wrong room looking for his dead wife's face. "The bathroom is the other direction," she said, taking the photo from me and setting it back on the shelf without looking at it. "Come on, let's get you back to the table. We have some paperwork to go over after dessert." I followed her back to the dining room. Marcus was gone. The table had been cleared. Daniel and Dr. Strand were sitting close together, talking in low voices that stopped when I walked in. A folder sat at the head of the table. "Dad," Daniel said, with the careful, patient voice of a man handling something fragile. "We just need to go over a few things. Some medical release forms, an updated insurance authorization, basic stuff. It'll just take a minute." He opened the folder and slid it toward me. Inside were pages of dense legal text. He had his hand flat over the lines I was meant to sign, covering the section headings, but I could see enough. The words "durable power of attorney" peeked out from under his palm. I reached for the pen he extended. My hand shook visibly, a sustained tremor that I let build as I brought the point down toward the signature line. I pressed down and then let my whole hand jerk sideways as if startled by a sound. The pen dragged a long, deep gouge across the page. "Oh dear," I murmured, staring at it. "I'm sorry. I don't know what happened." Daniel snatched the paper back. I saw his jaw tighten. He looked at Dr. Strand. Dr. Strand gave a small nod. "It's okay," Nicole said through her teeth. "We'll get another copy. We can try again." "I think Dad is tired," Daniel said, standing up abruptly, his composure fraying. "It's been a long evening. We should get him home, and we can handle the rest tomorrow morning. First thing. He helped me with my coat with hands that were not gentle. He walked me to my car with a grip on my arm that was slightly too firm. He said goodnight with a smile that didn't match his eyes. He told me he'd pick me up at 8 in the morning. I drove to the gas station 3 blocks away and sat in the parking lot for a long time. Then I called Jim. "Tell me you didn't sign anything," he said. "I destroyed the document with a pen," I said. "Accidentally, of course." He exhaled. "Good. Now listen to me. The hearing is at 9 tomorrow. If they show up with that affidavit—" "Jim," I said, "I need you to run a title search on Daniel's house. Tonight if you can." "His house on Redwood Court?" "Yes, and I need you to pull the records on a company called Meridian Capital. Daniel borrowed $900,000 and used my house as collateral on forged documents. I have photographs. I'm sending them to you right now." There was silence on the line. Then, "Robert, this is mortgage fraud. This is grand larceny. We can have him arrested tomorrow." "Not yet," I said. "I want to do this a different way." I looked through the windshield at the lights of the gas station. "Jim, do you remember the Harborside Group?" A pause. "Your commercial real estate LLC?" "Robert, that portfolio hasn't been touched in. How much is it worth right now?" I heard papers moving. "With the market where it is." "Robert, it's probably somewhere around 14 million. I was quiet for a moment. "And do you remember when Daniel and Nicole were losing their rental apartment 8 years ago? When they were 2 months behind and facing eviction? Nicole was pregnant with Marcus." Jim's voice became very careful. "You bought them a house." "I bought them a house through the Harborside Group," I said, "because Daniel had already burned through 2 business loans and I didn't want his creditors to find it. I set up a lease agreement at $1 per month. I told them a client of mine owned it and was providing a generous arrangement. They've lived there for 8 years. They've renovated the kitchen. They've thrown dinner parties. I don't think they've thought about who actually holds the deed in a very long time." There was a long, long silence on the line. "Robert," Jim finally said, "you own their house." "I own their house," I confirmed. "And unless I'm mistaken, Daniel just used my property as collateral for a loan from a private lender. Which means that when Meridian Capital discovers the fraud, they'll be looking for another asset to seize. The only substantial one Daniel has is the house he lives in. The house he doesn't own. Jim, I want to buy that loan. The Meridian Capital note. Every cent of it. Call them tonight. Tell them you represent a party who wants to purchase the note in full, cash, wire transfer. They'll be delighted to unload a delinquent loan. And then, first thing in the morning, I want you to prepare a notice to vacate for 4,412 Redwood Court." I could hear Jim breathing. "Robert, is it less than they deserve?" I asked. Another silence. Then quietly, "I'll make the calls. But Robert, the hearing tomorrow. How do you want to handle it?" "Let them come pick me up in the morning," I said. "Let them think they've won. I want them sitting in your conference room believing they're about to take everything I have. And then I want them to understand exactly what's underneath the floor they're standing on." I drove home. I let myself in, turned off the lights in the front rooms, and went to my study. Margaret's photograph was on the desk. I'd taken it from a trip we made to Maine the summer before she was diagnosed. She was laughing at something I'd said. I didn't remember what. I wished I did. "I think they underestimated who you married," I told her quietly. I sat at the desk and worked until 2 in the morning. By the time I went to bed, the Meridian Capital transfer had been confirmed. Jim had the paperwork ready. The title search on 4,412 Redwood Court had come back exactly as I expected. The notice to vacate was drafted. I set my alarm for 6, but I was awake at 5. I showered. I opened the closet where, behind a row of flannel shirts and old khakis, I kept the suits I'd worn when I was still practicing. I chose the charcoal one. Margaret had picked it out for me the year I was named chief of surgery. I knotted a silk tie the color of deep water. I put on the watch she had given me for our 30th anniversary, the one I kept in the back of the dresser drawer because it felt too fine for ordinary days. I made coffee and sat in the kitchen and waited. Daniel's car pulled up at 7:58. I walked out slowly, shoulders curved, face soft. I got into the back seat without complaint. Nicole was in the front, scrolling her phone. She didn't look up when I got in. "Good morning," I said. "Morning, Robert," she said, without warmth. "Where are we going?" I asked, making my voice sound gently confused. "Just to see a friend of ours," Daniel said, watching me in the rearview mirror. "Someone who's going to help us sort everything out." "That sounds nice," I said, and looked out the window. I watched the city move past and felt the recorder in my jacket pocket and thought about everything I'd built over 40 years. Not just the money, but the discipline, the precision, the understanding that every structure rests on a foundation that most people never think to examine. My son had never looked at the foundation. He had assumed it was solid. He had never considered that the ground beneath his feet belonged to someone else. Jim's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. When Daniel pushed open the glass door and I shuffled in behind him, I saw two other people already seated: Jim and a woman I didn't recognize who I guessed was Daniel's attorney. Daniel guided me to a chair and stood behind me with his hands on the back of the seat like a jailer. "Mr. Callahan," Daniel's attorney began, opening a folder. "Thank you for coming. We're here because Daniel and Nicole are concerned." "Just a moment," Jim said pleasantly, and slid 3 documents across the table. I watched Daniel's attorney pick up the first one. She read it. Her expression changed. Daniel leaned over to read it. I watched the color drain from his face. The first document was the notice to vacate. To the occupants of 4412 Redwood Court, Naperville, Illinois. You are hereby notified that your tenancy agreement is terminated, effective 30 days from the date of this notice, on the grounds of conduct materially harmful to the property owner, including but not limited to attempted fraudulent guardianship proceedings against the owner, forgery of real property transfer documents, and collateralization of owner's property without consent. "What is this?" Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. The second document was the Meridian Capital debt transfer. His name, $900,000. And at the top, where Meridian Capital's letterhead had been, it now read, Harborside Group, LLC, Robert E. Callahan, sole managing member. I straightened in my chair. I adjusted my tie. I let the performance end. Daniel looked at me, really looked at me. Perhaps for the first time that evening, his eyes moved from the document to my face, to the suit, to my hands resting flat and completely still on the table. His mouth opened. "You own our house," he said. "I bought it for you 8 years ago," I said. My voice was level, without anger, without grief, the voice I used in the operating room when I needed the team focused. "When you were about to be evicted, and Nicole was 7 months pregnant, I put it in the Harborside Group because I didn't want your creditors to find it. I told you a client of mine was providing the arrangement. You never asked questions." Nicole made a sound. She had gone very still. "I let you live in that house," I continued, "because you were my family. I paid property taxes on it. I carried the insurance. And while I was doing that, you were consulting with a physician to have me declared incompetent so that you could seize my accounts." I paused. "And you forged a property transfer to borrow $900,000 against my home." "My home, Daniel. The house where your mother lived and died." Daniel sat down. He sat down the way a man sits when his legs stop working. "I didn't," he started. "I have the documents," I said. "I photographed them in your office last night. I have the loan agreement, the forged transfer deed, and the email chain from Meridian Capital showing the default timeline. I also have the recording of yesterday evening's dinner, during which Dr. Strand documented what he believed to be cognitive decline based on behaviors I deliberately performed for his benefit." Daniel's attorney stood up. I need to speak with my client privately before." "Of course," Jim said, with the particular courtesy of a man holding every card in the deck. "Take all the time you need. I'll note that as of this morning, Robert is the holder of your client's primary debt and the managing owner of the property your clients currently occupy. The guardianship petition will be withdrawn, and if it is not withdrawn by noon, we will file a criminal complaint for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. We will also be proceeding with the vacate notice regardless." Nicole was looking at me from across the table with an expression I couldn't name. Not remorse, exactly, Something more like the shock of a person who has reached for a light switch in a familiar room and found nothing there. "You let us believe you were struggling," she said, and there was something almost accusatory in it. "I let you believe what your behavior invited you to believe," I said. "When Margaret was sick, we learned very quickly who in our lives saw people and who saw resources. I made a decision to keep the people who saw resources at a careful distance." I looked at her steadily. "You seated me at a table with a plastic cup, Nicole. You had a physician in your living room ready to sign a document declaring me incompetent. You had already selected the facility. I don't think my caution was unreasonable." She looked away. Daniel had his face in his hands. He was not crying, exactly. He was making no sound. He simply sat with his face covered, and I watched the shoulders of my son shake slightly, and I felt something that I did not expect to feel, which was grief. Not anger. Grief. Because the boy who had once fallen asleep on my shoulder watching baseball games was in that body somewhere, and I didn't know when exactly he had disappeared. "The debt is called," I said, standing. "The full amount, plus penalties and accrued interest. Jim will provide the accounting." I picked up my jacket from the back of the chair. "You have 30 days to vacate. I would suggest you begin making arrangements." "Dad," Daniel said, from behind his hands. I stopped. "We have nowhere to go," he said. I stood with my back to him for a long moment. Outside the window, the river moved through the city the way it always had, indifferent and constant. I had stood at this window before, years ago, when we were closing on Margaret's estate. Jim had poured me a glass of water, and I had drunk it, and looked at the river, and understood for the first time that life would continue requiring things of me even now. "There are 2-bedroom apartments renting in Elmhurst for around $1,800 a month," I said. "That's a reasonable neighborhood. It's within your reach if you both work, which I would suggest you begin planning to do." I turned and looked at my son one last time. "I'm not having you arrested today. That is not because I forgive you. It's because I want you to understand that I chose not to. That distinction matters." I walked to the door. Jim fell into step beside me. In the hallway outside the conference room, I exhaled slowly. Jim said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Marcus called my office this morning. He wants to know if you're all right." "Tell him I'm having lunch at the cafe on Wacker at 12:30, I said. "Tell him to meet me there." Marcus was already at the table when I arrived. He stood up when he saw me, and the look on his face was the look of someone who had been braced for bad news and was recalibrating. "You look different," he said. "I feel different," I told him, sitting down. I flagged down a server and ordered coffee in a real cup, ceramic, with a saucer. "Marcus, I want to talk to you about Northwestern, about how the year has actually been going, not the version you tell your parents." He looked at me carefully. Then something released in his expression, and he told me the truth that his scholarship had been inadequate, that he'd been taking out small loans to cover the gap, that he'd been working nights at a campus restaurant to make it work, and that he was afraid he would have to leave at the end of the semester because he couldn't make the numbers work. I listened to all of it. "Your tuition, housing, and living expenses will be covered beginning next semester," I said when he was done, "through a trust account managed by Jim's office. It will cover undergraduate through any graduate program you choose to pursue. You won't need to tell your parents about it unless you want to." He stared at me. "Grandpa, I can't." "You can," I said. "And you will, because you told the truth at a table last night when it would have been much easier and much safer to stay quiet. That is worth more to me than I can explain to you right now, but I intend to try over the years, if you'll let me." His eyes filled up, the way young men's eyes do when they're trying hard not to cry. He nodded once, firmly, which was enough. 6 weeks later, I was sitting on the balcony of my new apartment, on the 41st floor of a building overlooking Lake Michigan. The lake was gray and enormous, and alive in the way that large water is always alive, moving at its own pace, unimpressed by the city along its edge. I had a glass of scotch, the good kind, the kind I had been saving in a locked cabinet for years against some occasion important enough to justify it. I had decided that being alive and free and solvent at 68, after everything, was sufficient occasion. Inside, I could hear Marcus on the phone, laughing at something. He had moved into the second bedroom 3 weeks ago and was commuting to classes. He had started sleeping properly for the first time in a year, he'd told me, and I'd said nothing in response because there wasn't anything to say to that. Some things you just let be true. Jim had sent me a text that afternoon with an update. The guardianship petition had been formally withdrawn. The fraud complaint I had filed was moving through the system. Daniel and Nicole had moved into a 2-bedroom rental in a suburb south of the city. They were, by all accounts, surviving. I had not spoken to Daniel. I was not ready to, and I was old enough now to understand that not being ready was not the same as never. I held the glass with both hands, hands that had repaired hearts and cleared blockages, and held steady through procedures that could not tolerate error, and I thought about what Margaret used to say near the end, when she was tired of pretending things were better than they were. She used to say, "The truth is the only thing that doesn't cost you anything to carry." She was right. She was almost always right about the things that mattered. I had spent 40 years measuring the precision of physical structures, calculating loads and tolerances and breaking points, and I had somehow missed the structural failure happening in my own family. Or perhaps I had not missed it. Perhaps I had looked at it and chosen, out of love, to carry it anyway, thinking that carrying it was the same as fixing it. It was not. Some cracks cannot be filled. Some foundations must be poured again from the ground up. What I had now was clean. It was sparse and sometimes quiet in a way that felt like absence, but I was learning to understand that some absence is not emptiness. Some of it is simply room. I finished my scotch and set the glass down. The lake was darkening as the sun dropped behind the city, turning the water a deep, burnished blue. If you've ever been there, if you've ever sat at a table where the people around you had already decided your story was over while you were still living it, then you know that there is no sweeter moment than the one where you get to write the next chapter yourself. I put my hands on the railing. The air off the lake was cold and clean, and it tasted like the beginning of something. I breathed it in.